Meeting of the House of Commons Special Committee on the Canada People's Republic of China relationship. I've heard skiing described as a series of linked recoveries, and I think that also describes our process for putting these sessions together late on Tuesday evening. We've had to do a little bit of playmaking along the way here, but we'll go through the preliminaries for the benefit of the people on Zoom and get that done, and then I think we'll have also a decision to make around the vote that's expected a little bit later this evening, okay? So, pursuant to the order of reference of May 16th, 2022, the committee is meeting on its study of the Canada People's Republic of China relations. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the House Order of June 23rd, 2022. Members are attending in person in the room and remotely using the Zoom applications. For the benefit of the witnesses and members, please wait till I recognize you by name before speaking. For those participating by video conference, click on the microphone icon to activate your mic, and then please mute yourself when you are not speaking. Interpretation for those on Zoom, you have the choice at the bottom of your screen of either Floor, English, or French. For those in the room, you can use the earpiece and select the desired channel. Mr. Wright, are you all connected there? Perfect. Okay. A reminder that all comments should be addressed through the chair. For members in the room, if you wish to speak, please raise your hand. If we're in that kind of a session, for members on Zoom, use the raised hand function. I'll keep an eye on the screen for you. And, of course, we'll try and maintain a speaking order as best we can. Now, before we welcome our witnesses, I believe Mr. Chong wishes to raise a point.
Yeah, on a point of order, Mr. Chair, thank you very much. There have been discussions with various members of the committee, and I believe that if you seek it, you will find unanimous consent for the committee to sit until 8:25 p.m. tonight, then suspend for the vote that is to take place at 8:30, and then come out of suspension when the vote has been completed and members have returned to the committee. So I believe if you seek it, you will find unanimous consent to do that. That will allow our second and third panel of witnesses to maximize the availability of their time to provide testimony to the committee.
I'd also add to that we'll probably ask for unanimous consent to continue on for a wee while after the bells start ringing.
That was my suggestion, that the bells will start ringing at 8 o'clock. The votes are at 8:30. Yeah. I believe if you seek it, you'll find unanimous consent to suspend at 8:25 p.m.
Well, let's seek. Is everybody in agreement? Do we have unanimous consent for that? I think we're in good shape. Thank you very much. So, I'd now like to welcome witnesses for our first hour. Oh, one other thing, just before I forget. In our second panel, Dr. Sophie Richardson, who you'll see from Human Rights Watch, was scheduled to be here. She unfortunately did not receive the proper headset in time to participate, and for purposes of translation, we have to make sure that the right equipment is being used. So the clerk is making arrangements to have Dr. Richardson, who's a very valued witness in this process, appear at our next session. Just to flag that for you. So then, welcoming our witnesses for the first hour, as an individual, Dr. David Curtis Wright, Associate Professor of History at the University of Calgary, and as an individual, Guy Saint-Jacques, Consultant and Director. Mr. Saint-Jacques, I believe we'll start with you for 5 minutes or less.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Bonsoir, mesdames et messieurs.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, to this meeting of the Canada People's Republic of China relations. Thank you for this invitation. Thank you for inviting me to speak to you. I'll be speaking primarily in English, but I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have in French.
The China of Xi Jinping. As you know, the 20th Congress of the Communist Party of China is ongoing. While we know that Xi Jinping will get a third mandate as Secretary General of the party, the only suspense is whether he will have had to compromise with other factions in the makeup of the Standing Committee of the Politburo. Also, will he get a new title of chairman or leader of the people, which would give him a status similar to that of Mao Zedong. Based on his speech at the opening of the session, we know that he is not changing course as his goal remains to make China the greatest superpower by 2049. He warned CCP members, quote, to be ready to withstand high winds, choppy waters, and even dangerous storms, end of quote. He stressed also the need to tell the China story, to promote China's narrative, present a China that is credible and respectable, and better show China's culture to the world. Nous devons aussi reconnaître que la
We must also acknowledge that China has become a lot more influential in international organizations where it tries to control the debate, change practices to its advantage, and avoid any criticism with respect to its practices or policies. Quite recently, this is what happened at the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva, where China and its supporters managed to prevent a debate on a report presented by Madame Bachelet, who is the High Commissioner of the Human Rights Group on the situation in Xinjiang.
Despite the release of Meng Wanzhou and the two Michaels 1 year ago, our relationship with China is still very difficult, with almost no political dialogue. China keeps saying that Canada must learn from its mistakes. This illustrates how difficult it has become for all Western countries to engage with Chinese diplomats, as they reject any criticism and they follow the instructions of Xi Jinping of pushing back. The good news is that China has agreed to the nomination of Jennifer May as Canada's new ambassador to China. Mrs. May is a career diplomat who will do well in Beijing because of her relevant prior experience and her competencies, including in Mandarin, and I wish her the best of luck. Ottawa has been struggling with how to deal with China. We were first promised a few years back a revised engagement strategy with China by Minister Champagne, but the process got derailed. It then morphed into an Indo-Pacific strategy that Minister Joly has been working on for a year now. We learned recently that after all, it won't be unveiled before the Prime Minister goes to the APEC summit next month. So another delay. This is puzzling to say the least. While Ottawa is faced with the challenge of dealing with a bully that does not respect international law, it must still find ways to deal with it and push back when its values and interests are threatened. This should normally lead to an engagement strategy that is much more strategic and limited to areas where it is in our interest to pursue cooperation with China, assuming, of course, that it wants to entertain a more limited relationship. For example, on the environment, Canada has already a reputable record of providing assistance. We could provide China with clean technologies, liquefied natural gas, and green or blue hydrogen to help China to reduce its coal addiction. On public health and pandemics, Canada should continue to collaborate with China, especially to ensure it doesn't cut corners. Nuclear proliferation is another area that requires more discussion. Il est aussi crucial que
It is also crucial that Canada work closely with its allies to develop common strategies to oppose China's reprehensible behavior. One way to do this would be to strengthen the multilateral system and ensure that the UN organizations, including the WHO and the WTO, play their role and can be used to counter China. In this respect, I was very encouraged by the speech given last week by Minister Freeland before the Brookings Institution in Washington, where she underscored the need to reduce our vulnerability regarding totalitarian regimes, both politically and commercially.
I believe we've gone through your 5 minutes. I'm sure you'll have more to say, and we can maybe work that in as you respond to questions from the members here. Thank you very much for your presentation. Dr. Wright, you're up next for 5 minutes or less.
Thank you. I teach a course in Taiwan history at the University of Calgary. Every other year I teach it. I'm now completing a book on the White Terror in Taiwan, or Chiang Kai-shek's crackdown on suspected Chinese communist agents between 1947 and 1986 or so. I've been thinking and worrying about Taiwan for over 4 decades now. I first went to Taiwan in 1980 when I was still a teenager, and I've been crisscrossing the Pacific to and from that beautiful island ever since. I am still besotted with it today as I was in September 1980, but now I worry more than ever about mainland China's military threat to the island. In the free and democratic world, we feel an easy and natural affinity with fellow democratic countries and societies and long deeply to be in solidarity with them and protect them, if we can, against threats by non-democratic and anti-democratic dictatorships. But ironically and tragically, some of the steps that democratic countries wish to take towards protecting Taiwan's democracy may in fact achieve just the opposite result. As far as Taiwan today is concerned, are high-profile visits by political bigwigs from democratic countries the best way to support Taiwan? What if they make us feel good, but make hundreds of millions of people in mainland China feel very bad indeed? As I wrote in the Calgary Herald on the 6th of August this year, quote, on the mainland, a large majority of Chinese support unification with Taiwan, even by force if necessary, not out of mindless pugnacity or sheer cussedness, but because they feel deeply in their bones that China's loss of Taiwan in 1895 is a long-standing, grave historical injustice to China, one that may not be unredressed indefinitely, quote. My wife of 38 years, who is with me here tonight, was born in Taiwan to Chinese parents who fled the mainland in 1949 in the face of the communist takeover. She both strongly dislikes Chinese communism and understands very well that the overwhelming majority of people who identify as Chinese, including her, will never accept Taiwan formalizing and normalizing its current de facto independence. For her and the overwhelming majority of people in mainland China, China's loss of Taiwan to Japan in 1895 remains a deep humiliation, one that will never be erased until the effects of the Treaty of Shimonoseki are fully reversed. Today, she greatly fears that the failure or refusal by many Taiwanese today to take this threat seriously will end in unspeakable tragedy for Taiwan. I am sure that the situation in Ukraine right now does indeed give the CCP and the People's Liberation Army significant pause and great cause for concern. But this does not mean that the CCP will abandon the option of military force against Taiwan. China may defer its plans to invade Taiwan, but it will never abandon them. Make no mistake, China will attack Taiwan if it becomes convinced that Taiwan will always decline any and all overtures for peaceful annexation. China's saber-rattling and gruff pronouncements about Taiwan may look bellicose and buffoonish, and they may well be. But this does not mean that China is bluffing. It is not. I do not presume to advise this committee on all aspects of Canada-China relations, which are difficult and prickly right now. Management of these relations will require careful, prudent, and multivalent formulations. I only ask that this committee take Beijing's firm and recently reiterated commitments regarding Taiwan into account as it navigates the troubled waters of Canada's relations with China. A line in the ancient Chinese text Tao Te Ching says this, quote, no other folly or calamity is greater than underestimating one's opponent, end quote. I implore this committee and this Parliament not to underestimate or downplay or discount Beijing's resolve in this regard. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wright. It's time now for our first round of questioning. And with that, I'd like to welcome Mr. Seaback and Mr. Kimmich as our new Conservative members on this committee. Thank you, and good to have you here. Madame Normandin is representing the Bloc in place of Mr. Bergeron tonight, and Ms. Kwan is here in place of Ms. McPherson. And then on the screen, I recognize Mr. Iacono, who's doesn't look a bit like Jean Yip, but will be replacing her tonight. So with that, we'll go to our first questions. 6 minutes for Mr. Chong.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. Appreciate our witnesses giving their opening remarks. I know my father was deeply humiliated when he fled mainland China ahead of the communist advance southward, never to return to that land, and immigrating to Canada in 1952, severing his entire life, as millions of others have done over the last number of decades, because of the authoritarianism and human rights violations of that state. And I just wanted to make sure, Mr. Chair, that went on the record as well. I have a question for Mr. Saint-Jacques. As he mentioned in his opening statement, does Mr. Saint-Jacques believe that the document should identify the People's Republic of China as a strategic rival, as has been done with some of Canada's closest allies, such as Germany, the United States, and other very close formal allies of Canada?
Thank you, Mr. Chong. I think that we have learned a lot on China in the last 3-4 years. Of course, the detention of the two Michaels was a very difficult period, but we also have learned how China is adept at using trade as a weapon. We suffered a loss of $4.5 billion in exports after the arrest of Meng Wanzhou. More recently, Australia has been at the receiving end after former Prime Minister Scott Morrison asked for a full investigation on the origin of the COVID-19 pandemic. And we know also how much repression has increased in China under Xi Jinping. Listening to Xi Jinping's speech last Sunday, it's clear that he feels that he is on a mission, and clearly he wants to change the norms, the standards at the international organization. In my perspective, it should be easy for Ottawa to conclude that China has become a strategic rival, a competitor, and that we have to align very closely with our friends and allies.
Thank you, Mr. Saint-Jacques. I have another question. As you mentioned, the big meeting is taking place currently in Beijing, which will crown President Xi as for his unprecedented third term, and possibly provide him with the title that Mao once had. But there are signs that China is faltering. In fact, yesterday, the government of China delayed the release of key economic data, key GDP data, and rumors are flying around that that's because the data isn't very good. China's growth has dropped precipitously, as have a key element of their economy, which is their housing market. There has been many companies that have gone bankrupt and runs on banks that have been evident in China. And so I'm wondering if you could maybe comment on Xi's goal of creating China as the world's greatest superpower in the context of an economy that is faltering, and also in the context of a demography that is about to peak and then decline. And perhaps Dr. Wright could also comment on that as well.
Well, I think you described very well the situation that President Xi, General Secretary Xi is facing. In fact, housing represents 25% of the Chinese GDP. Housing construction is down 40% this year. The unemployment rate among young people 18 to 24 is 20%. There's lots of dissatisfaction among young people. Add to this the fact that probably this year we will see the start of the decline of the Chinese population, because last year there were 10.6 million births, but the number of deaths was about over 9 million. This year probably the number of deaths will be over the number of births. And if you add to this the death at the municipal level and the impact of the bad management of COVID on the Chinese economy, according to institutions like the World Bank, this will reduce growth by 2%, which means that China will be lucky to have a growth rate of 2.8 to maybe 3 point something.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Saint-Jacques. I'd like to hear from Dr. Wright on that, the challenges that President Xi will have in light of declining economic growth relative to the last 20 years and also relative to their demographic challenges.
A short answer, if you could, Dr. Wright. Thank you.
Okay, the economic decline is going to be very difficult for China. I think China is still an overwhelmingly export-oriented economy. And as world economic conditions worsen, it will worsen in China as well. There will be a lot of political implications for this, and I think Xi Jinping is gearing up for them. As for demography, by 2035, there will be only 3-point-something working individuals for every elderly person in China. No public pension system in the world could withstand that kind of strain. And that is why Xi Jinping is trying to download the responsibility back onto children, as it traditionally was.
Thank you, Dr. Wright. I appreciate your input, but we run out of time for Mr. Chong. It is time now to turn to Mr. Oliphant for 6 minutes or less.
And thank you to both the witnesses again for being here. I'm probably going to focus a little bit more on Mr. Saint-Jacques tonight. Just to give Dr. Wright notice, we may want you to come back when we get more into Taiwan, which will be a future study in the very near future. So just to give you a little heads up that I think your expertise could be helpful. Thank you, Mr. Saint-Jacques, for your comments. As always, thoughtful and strong, and avoiding jargon or rhetoric, which you do very well. And so thank you for that. I want to give you a chance to finish your remarks because I always think your finishes are strong. But I'd also like a little bit of it. I was getting a little sense, without you using the jargon that the government has been using, around areas of cooperation, areas of competition, of challenge, and then coexisting, the 4 C's that Minister Garneau used. You didn't use them, but they seem to be in line with your approach as we come out of perhaps a formerly naive approach to China and into a more eyes wide open approach. If you had any comments on that.
Well, thank you, Mr. Oliphant. In fact, I was getting in the part of my speech where I was congratulating the government on the adoption of the Declaration Against Arbitrary Detention in State-to-State Relations in February of last year. And I was going to add that, in fact, now is the time to maybe put some teeth to that declaration by talking with allies to agree on common responses, including sanctions, if China uses such tactics again. And I agree that, as I said, I think in my remarks, that we have to engage with China. This being said, I'm not sure that China will want to engage with us because the messages coming, for instance, from the Chinese ambassador to Canada, Peopleâ, are discouraging. He keeps saying that we have to learn from our mistake. But assuming that they want to play game and that ambassador is able to make progress, we have to define areas where it's in our interest, and I think also in the interest of China to work with us. I mentioned environment and climate change. Canada has had a long standing cooperation with China. We helped to create the Chinese Ministry of the Environment through the development assistance provided by CEDA. We helped to create the dairy industry. We helped in many areas, and we were financing the functioning of the China Council until a few years ago. On health, I don't know the situation now, but we used to have very good collaboration between Canadian scientists, Canadian doctors, and their Chinese counterparts. Unfortunately, the arrest of Meng Wanzhou has derailed such cooperation. This being said, also, I was quite encouraged to hear Minister Freeland in her speech last week in Washington, because in my view, she understands very clearly the challenges that we face with China, which is a country that has become more and more aggressive and assertive on the international scene, and does not listen very well to criticism. China has also started to decouple its economy from the rest of the world, and I think that this means that Canada has to work a lot more closely with allies in all kinds of areas, political subject, commercial subject, to try to develop common approaches and positions with regard to China.
Time is very limited. I wanted you to comment a little bit, because in that search for allies, we have a difficult situation following the UN Human Rights Council report that High Commissioner Michelle Bachelet did, where China was successful in gathering its allies together, perhaps more successfully than we were. And any comments on that?
Well, I think we have to. The question is for me, Mr. Oliphant. Yeah. Well, clearly we have to try to reinforce multilateral institutions. Canada is a small country when we look at it from an international perspective, and we need well-functioning international organizations, be it the World Health Organization, the World Trade Organization. And it's true that China has been using its assistance through the Belt and Road Initiative and its development assistance to rally support mostly from developing countries to good effect. As you said, the latest example came when the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva decided not to study the report of Mrs. Bachelet, which was a big disappointment. And for that, I think it's possible to work with allies, to work with developing countries to try to convince that their interests are better served by well-functioning multilateral organizations.
Thank you, Mr. Oliphant. That's your time. Ms. Normandine, for 6 minutes or less.
Thank you to both witnesses. I'm very pleased to be here at the committee. My question is for Mr. Saint-Jacques, and I go back to what Mr. Oliphant said and the fact that we need to find allies, particularly in the area of security. We're part of AUKUS. Some are saying that this is we're not part of AUKUS. Some are saying that Canada has not been invited. So because we're not as serious as we should be with respect to some aspects, the ambassador from France criticized our lack of our defense, our old fleets. Do you think that there are any aspects of our policies that we should take a look at in order to strengthen our relationship with our allies, particularly in the area of security? Unfortunately, you're quite right. Canada, on the international stage, well, our place has shrunk. I think that this began under the Harper government, and it continued, unfortunately, under Mr. Trudeau's government. We're now in a situation, and it's important that we understand that the international questions are really related to domestic issues as well. And if we don't invest enough internationally, that in turn will turn against us. Before, Canada had a very active diplomacy, and it had some added value. And it was appreciated in Washington because we were able to interpret the opinions of developing countries, because thanks to our official development aid program, we had a lot of relationships with a lot of African countries and Haiti. So the fact that we have not been invited to join AUKUS, but other fora as well, shows perhaps that we're paying the price for our years of negligence. As far as defense is concerned, I would say that Canada, it's clear that Canada has to invest more, particularly in the Canadian Arctic, because once again, going back to China, China is very interested in the mineral resources that are found there, and we're under-equipped. And if we were to put more investment in this area, it would show that we're serious. And we're serious about not only defending the North American continent, but everywhere. And I would like, I sit on the Defense Committee, and we're looking at Arctic security. The territory is huge, and the occupation of the territory is very slight. So what about the Northwest Passage? The United States doesn't even consider this to be Canadian domestic waters. Do we need to do more work to protect this area, particularly from the Chinese military? There's a Chinese ship has already gone through the passage. I don't think that the passage to the north is very important. China, well, it's more difficult to navigate through the Northwest Passage, but the Northern Passage is more direct, and we have to be able to count on the contribution of Russian icebreakers to get through. That being said, we have to adopt an approach that is comprehensive when it comes to the Arctic. We're talking about occupying the territory. If we're not present, it'll be very difficult for us to claim that we are able to protect the integrity of the territory. We have to have physical occupation there. We have to have the planes that can go there. We have to think in terms of global warming, too. There will be more and more resources that will become accessible. Fish are going more towards the north. We have to be concerned about this. We have to work with our friends on the Arctic Council, our allies, to deal with this. I have very little time remaining, but we at the House we have PMB C-181, which talks about media that should be banished or shouldn't have a license to work in Canada when they are associated with countries that commit genocide. There's about the Uyghur situation. Is this an aspect that we should at least looking at, the media influence? Yes, absolutely. And if I had an opportunity to complete my speech, I would have talked about the fact that we need to counter the Chinese influence, not only within the Canadian community, but also in our political institutions. The Chinese use all kinds of means to interfere. They take advantage of the fact that we're an open society. There are Chinese dailies that take out full-page ads in our media, and it's impossible to do the same thing in China. There's no reciprocity. So we have to be much more vigilant when it comes to that.
Thank you, Madam Normandin. Now to Ms. Kwan for 6 minutes or less.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for their presentations. I'd like to just actually build on that response from Mr. Shinshak. You mentioned about needing to counter the issue of influence, which is proliferating in many spheres in our communities across the country. Can you give me some specific examples as to what measures Canada should take?
Well, I think that we have to start by paying a lot more attention to what is said on Chinese social media. I was struck at the start of the Meng Wanzhou crisis. I gave many interviews to Canadian media that are publishing in Mandarin. And the questions they were asking me were straight from Beijing. They didn't know what was the position of the Canadian government. They didn't understand it. They were just reflecting the views expressed in Beijing. And for that, we have to make a lot more effort to go. I think also we have to look at the experience of other countries like Australia that has adopted 4 laws to try to counter foreign influence in its society and in its political system. That would be a good point to start.
Thank you very much. Just bringing, I guess, the issue closer to home. In Canada, a veteran journalist, Victor Ho, was put on a wanted list by China. And their application of their national security law is spreading. We have always known, because that's what they said they would do, to apply that law, not just in Hong Kong or China, but globally. So this is the first Canadian who's actually being targeted in that way. And so what do you think the Canadian government should do to counter this? Because it's the protection for all Canadians as well. So I would ask this question to both the witnesses. Maybe I can have Mr. Shinshak answer that question, and then we'll go to Dr. Wright.
Well, I agree entirely with you. I think the Canadian government should speak very forcefully on this subject to say that it will oppose any effort by China to use this national security law to try to get people. And what we have to understand that, in fact, if Canadians fall under, and it's easy to be found guilty, you know, I would be found guilty. I have been very critical of China. And what I fear is that China may want to use its extradition treaties with other countries. And if I ever go to visit one of those countries, they could request that I be arrested and extradited to China because I've been critical of China. So I think the government has to speak out on this. And this is another example where we have to work with our allies to develop common opposition to push back on China.
Questions like this are to take a longer term view like historians do over decades. As far as Chinese media, I read some of those newspapers. And sometimes it's disturbing. These are strangers in our land. Do they not really understand the way Canada works? But those people are first generation. Their kids and their grandkids are going to wind up thinking very, very differently. A lot of the influence that we are so concerned about with Beijing pertains to one generation. Their kids and their grandkids are going to come around a lot more. And that's really how it's always been over the course of Chinese immigration to Canada. As far as national security is concerned, I've read that law, and it does say anywhere in the world, people who damage China's interest are subject to arrest. Now, we often assume that will apply to Chinese citizens, but Mr. Ho is not a Chinese citizen. He's a Canadian Chinese. Will this eventually apply to non-Chinese people as well? I think maybe so. I don't see any impediment to that, and it's troubling.
Well, thank you. Actually, they are applying it to Victor Ho, and I am cognizant of the fact that not just myself, I think a number of us, in fact, many parliamentarians, would be in violation of the national security law, given our comments and our vote in the House on designating the genocide with the Uyghurs. So we could all be subject to arrest and be put on a wanted list, no less. I'll set that aside for a minute because I have much to say about that. But I do want to actually get to the Taiwan question. Given the threatening posture that's escalating with China towards Taiwan, and so from this perspective, what action do you think Canada should do to prepare itself, with this escalating tension? And what should we be doing with allied countries? Dr. Wright?
I will ask for a fairly short answer. We're just about out of time.
We should prepare ourselves for the possibility for a big and ugly and surprisingly strong conflict. That may be the price of standing up to Beijing on this. It's a price that we as a democracy, I don't see how we cannot pay it if it comes to it. As far as what Canada should do, Canada should work closely with allies. Canada punches above its weight in international relations, and I think that some quiet backstage discussions with Chinese diplomats, that works better than humiliating them publicly.
Thank you, Dr. Wright, and thank you, Ms. Kwan. We'll now go to our second round. Mr. Seaback, for 5 minutes or less.
Great, thanks very much. Mr. St. Jacques, you said that the ambassador has said Canada must learn from our mistakes. What do you think they mean by that specifically?
Well, when I was in Beijing, very often I had discussions where I was told that we were the lapdog of the United States. And, from the start of this sad episode with Mrs. Meng Wanzhou and the two Michaels, they said that we should not have listened. We should not have acceded to the extradition request. They showed total disregard for how extradition requests work. And they just assumed that things could work in Canada as they do in China, where the prime minister picks up the phone, speak with the judge, and say, throw this case away and just return the person. And so, to be frank with you, I don't think that the Chinese have a very high opinion of Canadian politicians right now. And this is unfortunate, taking into account all the efforts that were made by the various Canadian governments over the last 40 years to help China to become a modern country. We helped them to prepare to join the World Trade Organization. We helped to develop the dairy industry. We helped them to develop their hydro electricity. And all this has disappeared after the arrest of Mrs. Meng Wanzhou.
So I read a report from the Australian Strategic Policy Institute on coercive diplomacy, and incidents of coercive diplomacy have really seemed to have skyrocketed, at least according to this report, around 15 in 2016 to close to 60 by 2019. And coercive diplomacy can include all kinds of things. It can, of course, arbitrary detention, restrictions on official travel, pressure on specific companies. So this seems to be an increasingly worrying problem. For both our witnesses today, would you have any advice on how Canada should be dealing with coercive diplomacy with respect to China?
Well, I think it's very important to make the trade regime more reliable and predictable. And for that, I was surprised at the start of our problems, our latest problems with China, when they put a ban on our exports of canola. Why didn't we go immediately to the World Trade Organization to lodge a complaint? In fact, we have to use those mechanisms to push back on China. And I think that we are also at the stage where of course, as I said, a good first step was the adoption of this declaration on to try to prevent hostage taking in state-to-state relations. But on the trade side, I think also we are at a point where we have to work with allies to try to develop common positions. And to give you an example, there are very few countries that export barley, canola, or soya, wheat to China. So the next time that China wants to impose sanctions, punitive sanctions on Australia on its barley, Canada and the US would agree that they would not increase their exports above their historical share of the Chinese market. Immediately, that would send a message to China that the time where they were dividing us is over. And in fact, the EU is in the process of adopting a new anti-coercion instrument. There is a bipartisan Countering China Economic Coercion Act that has been introduced in the US Congress. I think we have to look at concrete examples like this to push back on China.
At a time, Mr. Wright.
Okay. China does crave positive public relations internationally, so creative embarrassment with other allies will work to some extent, even if China denies that they will. Diplomatic démarches can work. I think that quick reprisals for trade coercion should be engaged in. China says that politics should not have anything to do with trade, but the canola decision out in Alberta, that's very much politics interfering with trade.
Thank you, Dr. Wright, and thank you, Mr. Seebeck. We now go to Madame Normandin for 2.5 minutes or less.
Thank you. My question is for Mr. Saint-Jacques, and if you'd like to step in, Dr. Wright, please jump in. There is a work group from the University of Ottawa that recommended that Canada have a national coordinator position to the fight against foreign interference. I believe they have such a position in Australia. And since we don't have any central hub for dealing with interference, it seems to I'd like to hear what you think about the relevance of this type of position here in Canada. Would it be useful or even necessary? I think that's a very important question. I see a lot of fields where China interferes illegally. As I said earlier, it takes advantage of our open society. They understand how they can use this, how can use Facebook and other means to spread disinformation, to try to interfere in our political system. I think that this should involve a lot of departments. We need to be a lot more vigilant, and then we have to see how we can counter this. There are technological means that we could use. I don't know if a national coordinator position would be useful. I think that we need to convey the importance of this issue. That being said, if we look at the activities, the cyber activities of China, the way that it steals intellectual property, it interferes with cybersecurity, it tries to impinge on freedom of speech here in Canada. It's trying to undermine our democratic system. So we have to really take a close look at all of this. There is a task force that is currently looking at these issues, and we will be providing recommendations. I will find this very interesting.
I committed a rookie mistake, and I missed Mr. Fracascantos for your 5 minutes, sir. Are you ready?
Yes, Mr. Chair. Happy to go ahead. Could I ask Dr. Wright? There's a few things, as a matter of fact, but deterrence, as far as the potential invasion of Taiwan, is there anything to deter China from that? For example, the U.S. policy on coming to Taiwan's defense. Is this something that President Xi rules out automatically?
The question of Taiwan will, I think, boil down to a matter of regime survival. If, and this will never happen, but if Xi Jinping were just to announce that, okay, we're giving up on Taiwan, we're not going to use coercion at all, we're just going to woo Taiwan into coming over and joining with us. If he did that, there would be widespread public disagreement and anger. And I think that perhaps even a division or more of the PLA could get involved. The second red generation that is Xi Jinping's main pillar of support largely runs the PLA today. The PLA doesn't interfere with politics, but if it came to something like this, I think that the PLA might get involved. Xi Jinping knows this. Giving up on Taiwan would be tantamount to recognizing the possibility of regime overthrow. And when that is a possibility, the regime is capable of doing anything. That's the message of 1989 with the Tiananmen massacre. Deng Xiaoping says in a key meeting with the Changwei, how do you say that in English? A key core group of the Politburo, he says that, look, we will pay any price, we will endure any hardship to keep our political power. So Taiwan is a core interest, and it's a core matter for the survivability of the regime. And so I quite frankly think there is not a whole lot that we could do militarily. Now, we can make it very clear that there will be enormous costs, that China will be outcast internationally, that they would face massive world boycotts. But in the end, the CCP won't care.
The Asia correspondent for the Globe and Mail just a few days ago said that, James Griffiths said that the decision as to whether or not China invades Taiwan lies with one person, the president, President Xi. You would agree with that? It really comes down to what
Very
he
much
wants
so.
to
The
do.
way that politics are configured in China right now, the entire state architecture is an instrument for the will of one man. He has more political power gathered into his hands than anybody since Mao. And just yesterday, the American Secretary of Defense said that it appears to U.S. defense establishment that he is now ratcheting up the timetable. That, in other words, the invasion of Taiwan could come sooner rather than later. It's terrifying.
Oh, it is indeed. Chair, how much time do I have? 2 minutes? I guess the final question would look at what Canada can do in a situation like this. We heard earlier from Mr. Saint-Jacques that we ought to reach out more to multilateral organizations and seek to strengthen them as a middle power. But any advice, and I consult you instead of Mr. Saint-Jacques on this, no disrespect to him, but you offer a historian's perspective, and perhaps with that perspective, looking back to the Canadian tradition of being a middle power, are there things that we can do within multilateral organizations and continuing to engage allies? I think this is something that has been a central goal of our foreign policy, but it's difficult.
Canada should continue the course that it is right now with multilateralism. I think Canada should use its special relationship with the United States to encourage the Americans to continue to become more multilateral. But maybe doing the right thing is more a matter of not doing the wrong thing. Are there things that Canada might do that would provoke or hasten the attack on Taiwan? Sometimes it's better to do nothing at all than it is to do something stupid.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Fragaskatos. Now we'll go to Ms. Kwan for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you very much. At the beginning, Mr. Saint-Jacques, you raised the issue around the UN Human Rights Council vote. And there are, of course, implications with respect to that. And given that that is the outcome, and clearly is demonstrating to a degree as well China's ability to rally their allies. So in the face of that, and in the face of potential threats to our friends in Taiwan and other situations, the Uyghurs, and I can sort of go on, what specific action do you think Canada can and should do in terms of building up the allyship in the international community to address this ongoing and I think heightening situation with China?
Well, starting with the Taiwan issue, I think that Canada can do a lot if we say that we support human rights, we support democracy. We have to translate this into our foreign policy. And I think in that regard, it's important to continue with visit by parliamentarians. We have to support Taiwan to join multilateral organization. We should start to negotiate with them a free trade agreement. We should welcome them to join the CPTPP. And we should work with allies to deliver jointly a message to China to say, if you dare invading Taiwan, and I think that this could become more likely in 3 to 5 years from now, we should mention to them, here are the list of sanctions that we will apply so that they know what price they would have to pay. Already I see Canadian businesses that are starting to adjust their supply chains to become less vulnerable, less dependent on China. And so I think that, it's a matter of turning to the Uyghur. If we apply sanctions to counter the use of forced labor in China, that will also send a very powerful message. We have had some challenges to identify shipments of goods that could have been produced with forced labor. I think we have to do more. And again, it's a question of working with allies, developing common strategies, common approaches. And when you have tough messages to deliver, to go as a group.
Thank you, Mr. Saint-Jacques. And with that, that brings us to the end of our first hour, our first panel. Dr. Wright, Mr. Saint-Jacques, thank you very much for your attendance tonight. We'll now pause briefly while we get our second hour teed up.
Thank you.
for our second hour. Welcome back, and we're resuming the meeting with our second panel. A small panel this time. Dr. Martel, you are our witness for the next, I would say, 40 minutes. Because we have a vote coming up in the House of Commons fairly soon. So I would like then to introduce Dr. Stephanie Martel, Assistant Professor, Department of Political Studies at Queen's University. Dr. Martel, you have an opening statement of 5 minutes or less.
Bonsoir et merci.
Good evening. I'd like to thank the committee for inviting me to testify this evening and participate in this important discussion. My contribution is based on my expertise in international relations and on the Indo-Pacific region and the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. So my initial remarks will be focusing on the ambiguous relationship of China with respect to the liberal international order, which is based on a rule of law system. To do this, I will draw from relatively consensual and well-established considerations with respect to political, foreign, and defense analysis, but which really have to be front of mind because they do offer some very good lines of thought that are useful in thinking about the future of our relations with China.
Tend to learn from past experience, and this typically informs how they're going to interpret information and events. People basically perceive what they expect, and so their expectations, it is important to draw from what we know about the way that policymakers engage in foreign policy and defense policy are not necessarily always accurate, especially if they're rooted in misleading analogies. So this lesson that we can draw from foreign policy analysis has important implications for how we approach our relationship with China. So for example, Chinese policymakers will tend to expect China to be stigmatized or treated unfairly by the West in international fora, and they will behave accordingly. So that means that sometimes we'll see behavior on the part of Chinese actors exploiting loopholes or advancing particular interpretations of the rules in a way that is self-interested. This is not particularly surprising behavior, however, on the part of a great power. We also see a tendency among Western policymakers to expect China to behave like other states, particularly Russia, among other revisionist powers with values that have clashed with our own throughout history. Policymakers in the West also typically expect that what China is doing in areas that it will consider to be its core interests means that it will seek to do the same in other regions of the world, for example, the Arctic. But we should be wary about a number of these analogies and whether they actually hold up. Another lesson that we can draw from foreign policy analysis is that people, including policymakers, tend to see the actions of others as much more planned, centralized, and coordinated than they actually are. So that's even more so when reliable information is scarce, and in the case of authoritarian states. So there is a tendency to assume that everything China does is part of a coherent long-term plan or grand strategy, when in fact it is as likely to be the result of a disaggregate set of ad hoc, uncoordinated decisions from individuals and groups with competing interests, preferences, and worldviews. So while it is obvious that we should be concerned about the growing centralization of power in China, this doesn't mean that other groups and interest groups within the domestic politics ecosystem do not have various interests and preferences when it comes to China pushing for a more assertive position in the international sphere. People, including policymakers, also fear what they do not know. So those are typically, the unknown unknowns. So the fact that we don't know China's true intentions or China's true motives will typically lead to speculation to assuming the worst in virtually every domain of China where we observe, China behavior that can be a source of concern. This can lead, however, to confirmation bias being built into policy and potentially also lead to implications in terms of self-fulfilling prophecy that we should be mindful of. So I'm not sure that we can ever know, to be honest, what China's true intentions are, and this is for a number of reasons. So China, again, is not a black box. I don't think either that the intentions of policymakers are as clear, as coherent as we think they are. And finally, because motives and intentions typically change over time according to evolving circumstances. So this underlines the importance of supporting sound country expertise on China and Canada with knowledge of developments in domestic politics.
Thank you, Dr. Martel.
Yes.
If you have further things to say, you could hopefully work them in to the answers that you'll be giving our panelists or our committee. And in fact, we'll start with questions now with Ms. Dancho for 6 minutes or less.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witness for being here. I appreciated your opening testimony. I did find it quite interesting, actually. I've had been on China Committee before, and certainly it was an issue we studied at Immigration Committee when I was on that panel in reference to Taiwan. We also have studied at Public Safety Committee the Canada's security posture in response to Russian aggression, and China came into that discussion as well. So I was a bit surprised, actually, at some of your opening remarks. It seemed like, perhaps downplaying is not the word, but it seemed like you were saying that perhaps some folks on the international communications are overplaying the dangers that China has, that they aren't really as coordinated as some of us feel. Can you just clarify or further comment? I may be misinterpreting what you were saying.
Yes, so thank you for the opportunity to clarify. So I do think that there is, when assessing behavior and trying to unpack behavior and interpret the implications of that behavior from a particular state, there is a risk of threat inflation that we need to take into account. There is a risk in terms of assuming that speculation about what is going on is actually evidence that this particular behavior that we expect is going on. And I think that there is a tendency that we should be mindful of in thinking that the analogy between what Russia is doing in the international stage means that China will necessarily embark on similar courses of action. And I do think that it is important to consider the fact that China's relationship with the existing international order is much more ambiguous, and it is much less clear that China is aiming to act as much as a spoiler and a destabilizing force when it comes to the international order than Russia is at the moment. So it's about being wary about drawing analogies.
And what do you feel China's goals are in the international stage?
I'm not convinced that China seeks to overthrow the existing international order or to replace the United States as the main driver behind the existing rules. I think what is important to do when it comes to assessing China's behavior is to compartmentalize the discussion a little bit and focus on breaking down certain domains of international order, and then trying to assess whether China's behavior is merely pushing for a particular interpretation of the rules that doesn't align with our interests or preferences, or alternatively as seeking to overthrow the rules. I think there is a nuance, there is a difference, and here China's behavior, insofar as I can tell, is not it is not as clear that China is pushing for alternate conceptions of the rules than the way that Russia is actually doing it.
Thank you very much. And it's my understanding that in the last 30 years, 40 years, we've really provided a lot of our manufacturing jobs over to China, that the Western world has really led its foreign policy concerning China, that the more we build trade and relationships, the more China will become like us. I'm sure you've heard this, and that's certainly has not been the case. And we have a lot of vulnerabilities with China, as we saw during the Meng Wanzhou situation with the canola ban and pork and many others. So we are very vulnerable in some ways with our trade, although, of course, there are things. Of course, China needs to feed over 1 billion people, so they do need food, and Canada's a large supplier of that, but we certainly saw them take advantage of that. So I'm just concerned that it seems very much that their intentions are not, they're not necessarily for our interests, and certainly serving their own. You may have heard recently our Chief of the Defense Staff, General Eyre, has said that China wants to, his position is that China wants to remake the world to suit their needs. It's very much the position of our military, obviously. So can you comment on that? Are they seeing this wrong, in your opinion, or do our defense capabilities need to step up to meet this challenge that he sees?
So I think you're absolutely right to point out that our expectations of China becoming more like us have not materialized, and I think we need to adjust to that reality. Absolutely. What I don't think, though, is that from that we can derive the conclusion that China will behave in particular areas all the time in ways that conflict directly with our interests and preferences. So I think it's important to be able to identify the areas where indeed a difference of interests, values, and preferences can actually needs to be reacted to or addressed, in areas where actually or interests and preferences might align in ways that we don't necessarily suspect. And I think it's important to remember that the fact that China, that our expectations of China becoming, transitioning into as a liberal democracy through its embeddedness in the global economy have not materialized doesn't mean that we shouldn't continue to engage China and be able to find ways to convince them to engage in forms of behavior that align more closely with the way that we see the rules underpinning the international order to in ways that can sustain our interest and preferences in this regard. I don't think it's a mutually exclusive thing, but I do think that we need to move past these expectations that we're going to be able to see a transformation of China in a way that where China becomes one of the like-minded on virtually all domains. So
Thank you,
getting
Dr.
rid of these
Martel.
expectations and reacting to that is important.
Yeah, Ms. Dancho is out of time, but Mr. Cormier now has the opportunity to ask questions for 6 minutes or less.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Ms. Martel, for coming here this evening. I have a few questions on our commercial relations. I think that you will be able to answer some of these questions. In everything that we see happening on the world stage, and China is our second largest trade partner, we have the human rights are our priority, but when we look at our commercial relationship with China, we import so much from China. Should we be fearful? Should we be worried about our future for our businesses, for those that work with China? How do you see the current situation right now? Thank you for your question. I did say that the economic realm is a little bit out of my purview. I look at regional security in particular, but I'm perhaps let's talk about foreign investments. I'll take a very simple example. In my region, in our fish processing plants, a lot of the foreign investment has been made, investment from China. Would we be worried that the Chinese are taking over these businesses in our regions? Should we be worried about this in terms of our national security? I think that the doubts or the challenges or in the vulnerability that we are identifying, I think that should be a source of concern to some extent, but I also think that this foreign investment from China is a reflection of the interdependent global economy. The arguments in favor of decoupling, I don't know exactly how we use the term in French, but the fact that this concept of decoupling doesn't seem to be realistic in my view. I think the interdependence of China with the world economy ensures that we have to alleviate the risks of conflict. China is intertwined in the world economy, and we can use this to our benefit and push China to adopt approaches that are more in line with ours. And thank you. You talked about the centralization of power in China, and you talked about what's happening on beyond the borders and the dissidence that's now being heard. I think you would need to get an expert to answer that question in that particular field. But what I see with the tension and the development of Xi Jinping internationally, we can see that there's a greater centralization of power. I think that we do tend to exaggerate the comparison between Mao and Xi Jinping. I think this dynamic that we're observing in China is a response to their internal or domestic vulnerability. We have to be aware of the importance that we have to find a way to promote greater expertise in this area so we have a better understanding what's happening domestically in China. And you talked about the Arctic. You did talk about Arctic, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. Maybe did you talk about the security of the Arctic? Yes, I did. Yes. There's a lot of concern and speculation about the Chinese presence, the increased Chinese presence in the Arctic. We have a tendency to look at the unknown unknowns of China. We fear that there will be an increase in China's presence in the Arctic for reasons that are legitimate, because China has been very clear about what its intentions in the Arctic are. Obviously, China wants to develop its ability to have better access to the Arctic's resources, to have access to Arctic passages that would be favorable to them. I think it would be constructive and healthy to observe what China is promoting. It doesn't hide its intentions there. China is a stakeholder that has interests in this area. I think that rather than always looking for bad intentions, I think that this analogy doesn't hold water. China won't overnight claim sovereignty over the territory there. I think that Canada has to react should this prove otherwise.
And we've used up the time for Mr. Cormier. Now, Madame Normandin, though, has 6 minutes, and perhaps she'll ask you to continue.
Thank you very much. Professor Bartel? Yes, I would like to piggyback on what Ms. Statue was saying. Mr. Cormier talked about China's bad intentions, but this got me curious. Can you talk about any examples where we misinterpreted China's intentions, where in fact they didn't have a bad intention? I don't know if this is going to be a direct answer to your question, but there's the example of the sea. China, we made a big scene about the fact that China was not complying with international law, and that it didn't comply with a tribunal which it didn't feel was legitimate. This was a reaction which was very strong, and between the rhetoric and what actually happened on the ground, we can see that gradually China abandoned its claims through something we call the line. It stopped presenting its claims in a way that was judged by the tribunal as being beyond the limits of international law, and has been trying to adjust more and more its official position so that it complies with international right within the limits of what it can do, in the way that it interprets the rules of the law of the sea. So the reality has showed that China's this claim that China wasn't in compliance and that it acted inappropriately in a gray zone. Well, that's very much appreciated. Thank you. The current committee studied the case of the two Michaels. Since this has now been settled, could you explain what the current relationship is between our two countries? Very briefly, I don't see any fundamental change since then. We've now got through the crisis, and now maybe we have an opportunity to open some channels of communication that were closed previously. We can try to reestablish a more constructive channel of communication. And so we can maybe, when it comes to international governance, we can look at ways where we can do this more collegially. The way that China engages with all its rhetoric with countries which are liberal or Western in their approach, things haven't really changed much in that regard. Perceptions of Canadians with respect to China, according to public opinion polls, shows that it hasn't changed. So I haven't seen any real change since this crisis, but let's hope that we can restore our relationship in the future so that it's better than it used to be. China is it a good idea to integrate China in this strategy of Indo-China, or should we have a completely distinct strategy that applies uniquely to China? How can I say this? I think it would be good to have a specific China strategy, but I think that our position, our approach to China has to align with a coherent international approach. And I think that the two have to go hand in hand. Otherwise, the position of China is central in negotiations on any rule of law negotiations in this South Asian area. It has to align. And our strategy, our Indo-Pacific strategy, has to include China as a primary stakeholder.
Go to Ms. Kwan for 6 minutes or less.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the comments, Dr. Martel. My question, I think, to you kind of builds on this notion and from your opening comments that seem to indicate that perhaps the interpretation or read of China's intentions are misread in a variety of circumstances. Given what's happened in Hong Kong, and as we can see, the situation, the deterioration of what's going on in Hong Kong, and the violence, abuse, arrests of civilians in that context, and of course the imposition of the national security law and its application of it, even extending here to a Canadian, Victor Ho, a journalist, a veteran journalist here in Canada. I wonder if you can share with our committee, how should we exactly interpret those actions?
Obviously, I think that when it comes to what China considers its core interests, clearly or preferences are going to clash with those of China, or value system is going to clash with the value system of China. And I don't think we should shy away from pointing that out when that is the case. What I want to stress is that the fact that China and Canadian and Western, democracy's interests and values clash on a number of key issues doesn't mean that they clash everywhere. So that would be kind of the nuance that I would put to the committee, meaning that we need to disaggregate areas where clearly there are conflicting preferences and interests that need to be, put forward and discussed even warrants some condemnation. But this doesn't mean that on other domains of global governance, such as climate change or others, that we cannot find areas where we can actually align in terms of interest with China. So I think it's important for us to be able to have flexibility in our approach to China in this regard.
Well, thank you. Interesting. So should we have flexibility in our approach to the principle of democracy and in China's approach to Hong Kong, which they actually promised, not just to Hong Kongers, but to the international community, really, the promise of a one country, two system rule, to which they really very quickly dismantled. So how should we entertain the human rights, the principles of human rights and democracy in this regard, and how should we advance that with China, where we do conflict with our points of view in that?
I think China over the years has proven that it is impacted by naming and shaming on the international stage. Where I see a room for flexibility is that this naming and shaming, to be effective in terms of the end goal that we want, right? So for human rights to be respected, and for people not to be subjected to tactics and behaviors that we see as condemnable, there needs to be also room for diplomatic channels to push for or preferred courses of action. So this is where I see flexibility. Naming and shaming if the end goal is for us to feel better about ourselves as Canadians, only gets us so far in terms of the end game that we want, really, is for China to align its behavior in ways that are closer to what we would like to see. So there is room for flexibility in terms of pushing different channels and using naming and shaming tactics, for sure, that China responds to, even if it says otherwise, but also using back channeling as well.
When you say naming and shaming, and so there's, of course, the element of the inconvenient truth. And on the issue around Uyghurs and the genocide that's going on, China vehemently rejects the issue around human rights abuse for Uyghurs. And they say very clearly that is just simply untrue. So in the face of that, how should we approach dealing with that issue and trying to address that issue and ensuring that Canada is doing something to support Uyghurs that are faced with these violent human rights abuses?
About a 20-second answer, if you could, please, Dr. Martel.
It's very difficult. It's going to be very difficult for Canada alone to do anything of consequence. So it's really about building our relationships with like-minded partners to be able to push China and present evidence that China is engaging in behaviors that are condemnable and need to be condemned.
We're now into our second round. The bells are ringing, but we should get through the second round as long as everybody keeps as close to time as possible. So with that, we'll go to Mr. Kmitch for 5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Donc, maintenant, Professeur.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Professor Martel, I believe that my NDP asked you a very good question. How should we interpret the actions of Chinese leadership towards Hong Kong? We have seen how the Beijing government violated rules, and then after they violated human rights for Hong Kong. We're not just talking about theory here. We have a relationship with Hong Kong that's been in place for decades. Over 300,000 Canadians, our Canadian citizens, live in Hong Kong with their families. So we have some very close ties. It's in our national interest to ensure that our citizens are treated well when they're in other countries. So I'll re-put the question put by my NDP colleague. How can we interpret the actions of the Chinese leadership when they violate the rights of their own citizens, and then they do the same thing by sending out agents from their security service to our country here in Canada to continue with these intimidation tactics? Once again, this is a field where our values are in direct conflict with those of China. And I don't think we should shy away from finding ways to continue expressing our disagreement. I doubt that Canada has the capacity to have a real impact on the situation in Hong Kong if we don't go through multilateral channels and if we're not able to create or support cooperative relationships with other actors who can put some type of group pressure on the territory. That being said, once again, when we look at what China considers to be its own territory, and it's always difficult to ensure that our condemnation results in any positive consequences. And I share your concerns and about that. I am, in speaking about this, with respect to the second part of your question, I am aware of the violations, and I'm aware of the presence of the Chinese police that taking activities here. Once again, it's absolutely essential that we get evidence. We have to get our facts straight.
À l'anglais, ici.
And I trust that our police services will be able to shed light on those allegations.
English too. So you referred to territory. So there's a territory of Hong Kong, which is in fact a part of the People's Republic of China, and there's the people of Hong Kong. So let's make a distinction here. Do you believe that we can save Hong Kong, or do you believe that we can save the people of Hong Kong by offering as many of them an opportunity to come to Canada to find safe haven here in Canada, and safe haven then meaning also that we ensure we can protect their rights as Canadian citizens, as permanent residents, as individuals working here, from foreign influence and intimidation campaigns from the People's Republic of China?
I think obviously that we certainly can do something within what falls within our own jurisdiction, and making sure that the allegations that are waged are followed through, and that we get our facts straight and are able to respond accordingly. Absolutely. So as to in terms of what Canada can actually do towards Hong Kong, again, I do think that using multilateral channels and using our networks and connections with other international partners is crucial. And apart from that, I don't see honestly a lot for Canada as in and of itself to do to make sure that the situation resolves. But I think that working through our partnerships and alliances and using diplomatic channels might yield, results.
Thank you, Mr. Commit. We'll now go to Mr. Oliphant for 5 minutes.
I will use Ms. Normandan's line of questioning. I think she asked some very wise questions. I'm a little sad to see that this is the first time that you're here at committee.
For her time with us today, because I think she's doing an important thing as we start this new phase of our committee work. And that is to calm us down and to be rational and be evidence-based. And I just want to follow up a little bit on that because, and I'll speak very personally, that I think when I began my time as a member of Parliament, I had a very strong and open understanding of China, and I wanted to have stronger relations. I had 2 trips to China that were eye-opening. They were my first 2 trips. And then Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor were arbitrarily detained for over 1,000 days. And that is still with me as an individual, and I think it's still collectively with our with the people of Canada. I think we are still hurting from that arbitrary detention, and we're now moving into a new phase where we're looking for an opening to see should and can we open a different door with China. The should we question has to do with perhaps better peaceful relationships in our world and that kind of stuff. But is it in Canada's interest? Is it in the world's interest? Is it in Canadians' interest? And if we wanted to do that, what is your recommendation on how we do that? Because sometimes I just don't know. We're passionate people, and we've been hurt, and now we're trying to look for possible a new way. So, any thoughts you have on that?
To your question, I don't think we have much of a choice, to be honest. So China, is a great power and it is not going away. So we need to find ways to be able to deal and live with that reality. That said, I do think that Canada has a good record when it comes to engaging in informal mechanisms of diplomacy through expert diplomacy, for instance, and also other channels that might be used to find, areas where our interests might converge. So clearly, we're not going to agree on a number of different things, and on some domains, our interests and preferences are clearly going to clash. And I think that's just something that we will need to be aware of, and make China aware of. But that doesn't mean, in my opinion, that that it means that we cannot, also use or informal and formal diplomatic channels to be able to find some convergence of interests in certain domains.
Maybe we're going to travel to understand the situation better and our multilateral possibilities and instincts. Are there suggestions of where you think this committee may get a better understanding on how we could relate to China?
Anything that can support country perspective and country expertise when it comes to China, but also having to be able to tap into our networks that are connected with regional perspectives on how to deal with China and how to deal, with just great power rivalry in general. And this is where the ASEAN angle might come into play here. I think is something that deserves more attention. There is a tendency when it comes to discussions about or foreign and defense policy in the Indo-Pacific in general, but also towards China in particular, to favor a certain kind of expertise, which is absolutely needed in these discussions, which is, the perspective of Canadian expertise on foreign policy and defense policy. But I do think that whatever we can do to make room for regional expertise and perspectives that are anchored in the region is really needed.
I'm sorry, Mr. Oliphant, you are out of time. Madame Normandin, for 2.5 minutes, please.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you. General question. When there are two big powers, one is, and they're both based on different rules, and you can't have the same analysis. You can't compare this to Russia. There may be an opportunity to occupy space. Is that an analysis that we could also do with respect to China and the way it intervenes when there's a conflict? And secondly, what could smaller powers, and I would include Canada here, in finding alternative solutions to problems with China and in the Indo-Pacific area? I think that if you think at the way that the engagement of the United States and its way that it stepped back was beneficial to China. It stepped away from various platforms, and this was viewed as a way of mitigating contradictory opinions. And if we have this type of reaction, that is, we step back, and I don't think it's necessarily a solution. I think that we have to keep as many doors open as possible on diplomatic fronts it has to be more positive, less driven to conflict, and all actors would then benefit. I think it is especially important, therefore, that Canada be able to use its Indo-Pacific strategy to renew its engagement, its multilateral engagement in the region, and to ensure that we have a formal presence within key institutions, and that we have ears in these territories, showing once again how important it is that we have informal diplomacy so that we can take action in the region where there are growing concerns between the big superpowers. This we will perhaps turn to smaller powers, middle powers, and create opportunities to create an approach that doesn't have so much conflict in the region.
Now to Ms. Kwan for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I'm wondering what comments Ms. Mattel can offer to the reality that in Canada, a Canadian has now been put on a wanted list, Victor Ho, for violation, supposedly from China on the national security law, and the latest situation in England, where a protester who was demonstrating against President Xi Jinping and was reported to have been dragged inside the consulate grounds and beaten, and clearly issues of concern with respect to democratic rights for, in this instance, British, the British, and in our instance with Victor Ho, Canada is being challenged. How should we interpret those incidents, and how should we respond to it?
I think obviously we need to be concerned about these incidents, and clearly, so again, like when it comes to the potential that a Chinese presence, state-sanctioned, potentially illegal activities of surveillance are being carried out. I think this is a matter of getting a fact straight and making sure that whatever kind of behavior that falls outside the line of legality need to be addressed and responded to. When it comes to the other incidents that are mentioned, I do think obviously that this is a key concern and a preoccupation that needs to be addressed. That is also rooted, unfortunately, in the kind of basically vicious circle of animosity that gets created, between China and Canada, and its repercussions on the toxicity, basically, of the public debate as well, that we need to factor in. But obviously, these are cause for concern, and we need to react accordingly.
Thank you, Dr. Martel. Now, we're coming to time for a vote, but we would have time for one quick question and answer from each party. Mr. Commit, do you have another quick question that you'd like to work in? Okay. Mr. Oliphant, I know you had another question that you didn't get to, but Mr. Fragastatos, the floor is yours. Quick question, quick answer, please.
Yes, thank you, Chair, and thank you to the witness. On travel, if this committee was to travel in order to enhance its understanding of Canada-China relations, which countries in particular, Professor, should we look at going to?
I think when it comes to having, a very well-established experience in navigating difficult situations that have to do with great power rivalry, that there are a number of ASEAN countries where that Canada needs to connect more with in terms of both defining our approach to China, but just major power rivalry in the Indo-Pacific in general, and also in terms of the Indo-Pacific in general. And that would be, on my mind, Singapore, Vietnam, and Indonesia as being really key players in discussions about the reform of a regional order grounded in the rules.
Japan, South Korea, and
Excuse
Australia,
me,
possibly?
Mr. Frankenstatus,
Okay.
we'll move on. Madame Normandine, do you have a quick question that requires a quick answer?
Merci. Oh, thank you. I don't know if it's going to lead to a quick answer. The Indo-Pacific strategy, it was said that China would be part of the strategy. Should North Korea be part of this Indo-Asian strategy? I think that unavoidably, when we look at North Korea is doing, well, North Korea is a member of the National Forum of ASEAN, and this is a privileged place where Canada is also a member and can propose ways to open communications with North Korea. And I think that our engagement in this forum should be sustained.
Ms. Kwan, do you have one more question?
Thank you. Given that China has launched on multiple occasions now ballistic missiles over Taiwan, and there are many Taiwanese Canadians who are very concerned about the state of play. I wonder if the professor has any comments on how should Canada be communicating our concerns on this with China, and how can we show our support to Taiwan and Taiwanese Canadians who rightfully are very concerned about the situation?
I will say that I very much share the notion shared by a member of the previous panel that sometimes doing the same, carrying out with what we've been doing is probably better than, missteps or finding new ways to act that might be detrimental to the kind of virtuous. Well, that's not that might lead to avoiding the vicious circle scenario that we want to avoid. I do think that there is no solution to the Taiwan issue that is outside of diplomatic channels when it comes to Canada in particular, and so that we need to reinforce these kinds of solution as our best course of action.
Dr. Martel, you've done double duty in this last segment, last panel. You've handled a lot of questions extremely well, and we do value your attendance here tonight. With that, we have a vote coming up in about 5 minutes, so we will pause and come back after the vote and continue with panel 3. back to order for our third round. Thank you all for going and doing your democratic parliamentary duties, and welcome back to our third hour. I'd like to welcome our witnesses for the third hour today as an individual, Dr. Thomas Junot, Associate Professor, Graduate School of Public and International Affairs, the University of Ottawa. As an individual, Vincent Rigby, Visiting Professor, Max Bell School of Public Policy at McGill University. And from the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, Jonathan Berkshire Miller, Director and Senior Fellow, Indo-Pacific Program. We'll ask each of our guests to provide us with a 5-minute comment, and then we will go into one round of 5 minutes each to each of the parties represented here. So we'll start with you, Dr. Junot, for 5 minutes or less.
Thank you. So thank you for the opportunity to talk to you today. What we will do, Vincent and myself, is to talk about the key findings and recommendations from a report that we published with the University of Ottawa's Graduate School of Public and International Affairs earlier this year in May. The report was co-authored by Vincent and myself with the support of a task force of a dozen senior retired officials, including Deputy Ministers of Foreign Affairs and Defense, 4 former National Security Advisors, 2 former Directors of CSIS, former ambassadors, and others. The report is available online, and I'm happy to pass it on to the committee in an electronic form. The report deals with the deterioration of Canada's threat environment and overall makes 65 recommendations on what we can do. And many of those recommendations are relevant to the committee's work on China. So the starting point of the report is one that will be familiar to everybody here, which is Canada faces a growing range of threats from great power competition, including, of course, the rise of an increasingly aggressive China, to terrorism and extremism, both domestic and international, and a range of transnational issues, including climate change, pandemics, and so on. And our core message in the report is that we are not ready collectively to address the growing range of threats that Canada faces today. Successive governments in Canada, in our view, have tended to neglect national security issues. And to a large extent, we did that because we could. We are blessed by geography in this country. We are sheltered in North America and under American protection. But our main point in the report is that that luxury is eroding. And as these threats intensify, our fear, and this is based on the collective wisdom of quite literally hundreds of years of experience at the highest levels of government in our task force, is that we will pay an increasingly high cost because we are not ready to address these threats. To be clear, China is not the only threat that we discuss in the report, but it is, of course, a major and a central one. I think the committee is well aware of this aspect, so I will go on it very quickly. China poses a threat to Canadian interests through cyber attacks, economic espionage, foreign interference, its growing military assertiveness in the Indo-Pacific, and so on. I think the value added of the report is the next question, which is what can we do? So of the 65 recommendations we make in the report, quite a high number are directly or indirectly relevant to China. I'll mention only a couple ones, broad ones, and then Vincent will take over with a few more specific ones. The first I want to mention is a really general one in terms of our response, which is the need for a whole-of-society response to the range of threats that China poses. For most of the challenges that I just mentioned, the intelligence community cannot respond on its own. Of course, it has a central role to play, but it needs to work with other partners in the federal government, economic departments, and so on, but also with provincial governments, municipal governments, the private sector, think about economic espionage, and also civil society. Think about, in particular, foreign interference with the Canadian-Chinese diaspora. We need to do a much better job in this country at this level, in the federal government's ability and willingness to lead, to coordinate, to share intelligence on threats, and advice on how to deal with these threats. Just within the federal government, sometimes among national security agencies, obstacles to information sharing impede our ability to respond. It's even more of a problem beyond the national security community with the rest of the government, economic departments like I said, and so on. And it's even more of a problem when you look beyond Ottawa with other levels of government, the private sector, and civil society. Yet these other actors all have an important role to play in dealing with that range of threats. The second recommendation I want to mention is on transparency. Our first line of defense against many of the threats posed by China, and others for that matter, is not always CSIS or the RCMP or CBSA. In many cases it is, but in other cases it's societal resilience. For example, against economic espionage or foreign interference. The target of these threats is not, in most cases, the federal government itself. A lot of factors go into building societal resilience. We could have an entirely different discussion on that, but one of them is trust in government, which is a challenge in democracies today, including, but not only in Canada. There's no magic recipe to build a societal resilience, but at the center of doing that has got to be transparency, more transparency.
You've hit the 5-minute mark.
Yeah.
You'll be now eating into Mr. Rigby's 5 minutes if you continue.
So
That's not fair.
in 20 seconds, we need to define transparency more broadly as engagement, sharing information, sharing insight on threats to Canadian civil society and the private sector in general. And I'll stop right there.
So I still got 5 minutes.
Pretty close.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, for the invitation to be here tonight. It's a great pleasure and it's an honor. During a 30-year career in the public service, I appeared many times before parliamentary committees as a government official. So this is my first appearance, as the chair said, as a private citizen. And I must say I feel slightly less stressed than I did when I was a government official. But I guess we'll see how the next hour goes, and maybe we'll have a different conversation at the end. In one of my last acts before I retired last year as a National Security and Intelligence Advisor to the Prime Minister, I gave a speech to the Centre for International Governance Innovation, CIGI. It was one of the rare occasions when an NSIA has spoken out publicly on national security issues. The theme of my speech was Canada's response to a changing global environment, argued that the world was at an inflection point. It was experiencing seismic political and economic shifts and facing a complex array of new and old national security challenges. At the center of this change was heightened geopolitical competition. This competition was reflected in a tilt of the international balance of power towards the Indo-Pacific region. And the defining element of this multipolar transformation was, of course, the rise of China. I identified Beijing's political, economic, military, and technological emergence as one of the key international developments of this century, and suggested that China would continue to be a significant international force in the years to come. China had become much more assertive in its region and beyond. It had expanded its power and influence, including through the Belt and Road Initiative, and it also attempted to directly undermine states it perceived as competitors, often, as we know all too well in Canada, within their own borders. China leveraged a well-integrated economic, military, and diplomatic toolkit, as well as human and cyber-enabled espionage, to achieve its objectives. Based on this analysis at that time, and this would have been June of 2021, I concluded that the People's Republic of China represented a key strategic threat to the West and to Canada. So it's a year and a half later, and I see no reason to change my assessment. And indeed, the Ottawa report, which I did co-author with Thomas, put an exclamation point on my views. China remains assertive on the global stage, as we've seen with its threatening behavior towards Taiwan, its suppression of democracy in Hong Kong, and its continued treatment of its Uyghur minority. And its activities in Canada continue. The latest CSIS annual report identifies China activities in such areas as foreign interference, espionage, and cyber threats. The Deputy Prime Minister's speech in Brookings last week identified China as one of the world's dictators who are guided by entirely different principles from our own. She placed emphasis on economic security, saying that China was, and I quote, adept and intentional in using its economic ties with us as leverage to achieve its geopolitical objectives, end of quote. So collectively, these types of activities undermine our democratic institutions, our fundamental rights and freedoms, social cohesion, and our long-term prosperity. So if we agree that such a threat looms, how should Canada respond? Building on the Ottawa Review report and Thomas's earlier comments, let me just make a few quick suggestions before we go to any questions. First, we need a new national security strategy that brings together all the government's assets, from intelligence to defense to diplomacy to international development, in an integrated and in a coherent way to counter the national security threats of the 21st century, including state actors. We have not had such a strategy since 2004, almost 20 years. We stand out among our Five Eyes allies in this regard, which regularly publish such documents, and I'm sure all of you know that the United States published its national security strategy last week. Second, as part of that strategy, we need a specific integrated plan to counter the activities of hostile state actors. This would include China, but also Russia, Iran, and others. This includes identifying specific measures and tools to counter espionage, to counter foreign interference, disinformation, and cyber and economic threats. Third, we need a home and an away game. National security covers both domestic and international dimensions. In this context, I do look forward to the expected Indo-Pacific strategy that will be coming out, we hope, soon, which should bring our foreign policy, defense, and development tools together to tackle threats in the region, and it should focus on China in the region, in my view. Finally, we need to work with partners. So at home, as Thomas just pointed out, and to re-emphasize the point, because I think it's a really important one, this means other levels of government, the private sector, universities, and research institutions, which are under threat from foreign actors like never before. It's not just state to state anymore. Individual Canadians can be impacted. Sharing information with the Canadians in a transparent fashion will be critical in making this happen. And of course, internationally, this means our close friends and allies, including in the Five Eyes and the G7. China likes nothing more than to divide and to conquer. We need to stay together. Mr. Chairman, we live in a complex and a dynamic world where, as the Deputy Prime Minister said in a recent speech, we do have to find ways to coexist with competitors who do not share our values. This includes China, where we can potentially find common ground on issues like climate change and like the management of pandemics. But we must do so with eyes wide open, clearly recognizing...
Thank you, Mr. Rigby. That is your 5 minutes with a little
I had one sentence, literally.
Well, finish then.
But I want to repeat the eyes open because I thought it was such a good line. But we must do so with eyes wide open, clearly recognizing their strategic intent, and be ready to respond both at home and abroad to threats to our interests and values. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Miller, 5 minutes for you.
Thank you, Chair, members of the committee, for the invitation to speak before you today on such a critical topic to Canadian interests. I'll be frank, time is not on our side, obviously not just the 5 minutes, but on this topic itself. Increasingly, the international rules-based order appears to be hanging by a thread. Large nuclear weapons states such as Russia and China continue to coerce, albeit in different manners, neighbors to achieve their maximalist interests. Meanwhile, smaller countries like North Korea pursue weapons advancement aimed at holding regional countries like Japan and South Korea vulnerable to nuclear blackmail, often with tacit support and backing from Beijing. Chair, for too long, Canada has been approaching its foreign policy toward China in tactical rather than strategic terms, thinking only of short-term goals rather than long-term challenges. Unfortunately, it took the plight of two detained Canadian citizens, Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor, unjustly detained for nearly 3 years, for Canadians to awaken to the real challenges in dealing with an increasingly authoritarian actor in Beijing. In this context, it is overdue for Canada to frame a serious, clear, and coherent strategy towards China, situated within the context of a greater Indo-Pacific strategy, as my colleagues mentioned. In terms of what that might look like, Canada must first finalize and implement an independent and interest-based strategy for the Indo-Pacific that engages its regional partners. Countries like Japan, Australia, India, South Korea, and also working with Taiwan are all important in one way or another. Canada should also look to complement its engagement with a renewed vigor and focus on robust and comprehensive relationships in Southeast Asia with countries like Indonesia, the Philippines, and Vietnam. If we strengthen trade ties, increase security cooperation, and improve our diplomatic linkages, we can meaningfully offset some of the challenges posed by China's increasing challenge to the rules-based order. Moreover, multilateral organizations and trade agreements, such as the Association of Southeast Asian Nations and the CPTPP, alongside other ad hoc minilateral alignments, all provide potential anchors for a renewed approach to this region. But let me be clear. The Indo-Pacific strategy that's being developed should not ignore or dilute the challenges of China, nor should it be monopolized or fixated on Beijing. A real clear-eyed approach to Beijing and the risks it poses to both our neighbors, but also to the rules-based order more broadly, must be a foundational element to any strategy in the region. Toward China itself, Canada must be far stronger and clearer on issues of human rights. This includes clearly and consistently calling out China's egregious behavior against Uyghurs in Xinjiang, Tibetans, and other religious minorities, as well as condemning China's clear and escalating violations of the Sino-British Joint Declaration over Hong Kong. In each case, we should avail ourselves of our ability to apply Magnitsky sanctions against known human rights abusers, and we should explore paths for greater refuge, resettlement for individuals at risk of political imprisonment. But we must consider other challenges as well. China's desire to dominate the critical materials and raw material supply chain, for example, is a long-term challenge with serious national security implications that Canada must address in tandem with its partners in the region. Meanwhile, heated tensions and provocative acts that threaten the stability of Taiwan is simply the latest in a sustained list of concerns with Beijing's increasing military posture in the region. Indeed, the stability in the Taiwan Strait is directly connected with China's other assertive moves in the maritime domain. The Indo-Pacific, frankly, is facing a host of shared security challenges, from maritime piracy and crime to heated territorial disputes. In this vast maritime space stretching from East Africa to the Pacific Island chains, the foundations of regional commerce and security are secured through freedom of navigation and secure sea lines of communication. Yet there are several key challenges to this order, and China is posing these challenges. In the South China Sea, for example, Beijing continues to practice salami-slicing tactics aimed at ensuring its de facto control of much of this key waterway. Meanwhile, Beijing also continues to raise regional concerns through its constant incursions into the maritime airspace surrounding Japan's Senkaku Islands in the East China Sea. Finally, Canada needs to diversify its trade away from China and towards partners in the region, understanding the risks of over-reliance on the Chinese economy. This should include the creation of a dedicated mechanism amongst democracies to support one another when countries like China use economic coercion to achieve their ends. Such action would send a strong message that targeting trade for political purposes, as China did with Canada's canola, cattle, and pork exports, will be unsuccessful. Most importantly, and in conclusion, our relationship with China must be contextualized in the broader Indo-Pacific region. No longer should we consider bilateral ties with Beijing as an exceptional relationship, but rather as simply one important relationship amidst many in a diverse region. Canada must urgently rebalance its relationship with China and ensure it advances its interests, both in national security terms, but also, importantly, in tandem with its partners. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Miller. We'll now go to one 5-minute section for each party, and I believe we'll look to Mr. Chong for the Conservatives.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to our witnesses for appearing. I was struck by your opening remarks about the need to work more closely with allies and partners in the, not just in the Indo-Pacific region, but around the world. I was surprised, I think as many people were, about the July 7th press conference. Unprecedented, I think, joint press conference between the head of the FBI, Director Christopher Wray, and the head of MI5 at MI5 headquarters in Thames House in London this past summer, where both Christopher Wray and Ken McCallum, the Director General of MI5, gave an unprecedented press conference saying that China presented the biggest threat, not just to the United Kingdom, not just the United States, but to allies in Europe and elsewhere. And they also indicated that the government in Beijing had definitely interfered in the congressional elections in New York State this year, and I think that many Canadians have concluded that Beijing interfered in the last federal election as well. So your comments ring true. My first question is a very simple one. Have you had any indication that PCO, other central agencies, or the departments responsible are looking at a new national security strategy for Canada, since we haven't had one since 2004? Is there any indication that the government is seized with this idea of coming forward with a new national security strategy to parallel the Indo-Pacific strategy?
I'm not aware, sir.
Okay. Mr.
I'm not aware yet.
Okay, thank you for that. The other question I have relates to the to be released Indo-Pacific strategy that is to come out before Christmas this year. My question is to each of you: what do you think is the essential thing that, or things that must be included in any credible Indo-Pacific strategy? So when that document gets released, what will you be going through it looking for this December?
Thank you very much for the question. If I can answer that quickly first, I think we need to balance For too long, the way that Canada has approached this region has been overly focused on economics and investment. I think we need to realize, and I think my colleagues also highlighted this through their statements, the severe security challenges we're facing in this region, whether it be in the South China Sea, whether it be in the Korean Peninsula. And we need to have that empathy with our partners. We can't just base a strategy purely on what we want. Of course, it needs to be premised on our interests, but it needs to take into account the empathy of our partners and what sort of engagement they want from Canada. So I think that's very much what I'm going to be looking for.
Thank you.
I agree very much with what Jonathan said. I do hope that it addresses the security issue head on. And whether you like it or not, China is the 800-pound gorilla in the room. And so it should not be focused exclusively on China. And there was a conscious decision made not to focus it exclusively on China. I think that's the right decision at the end of the day. It should be broadly regional. But China is there, and it cannot be ignored. So security has to be front and center, I think. At the same time, I think any strategy needs to be fully integrated, and I use this word a lot for any strategy that we do, whether it's national security, Indo-Pacific, or a broader foreign policy strategy. It's got to include defense, it's got to include diplomacy, development,
well, we know there's a defense review going on right now as we speak, and presumably there's coordination between the Indo-Pacific strategy that's being worked on and the defense policy.
Well, and this is where it'll get interesting because the defense update, I think, was called not long after Russia invaded Ukraine and might have had a European focus, but I hope it's got a global focus, and I hope it's got a domestic focus as well, because lots happening in our own neighborhood, so it definitely needs to be fully integrated. And the last thing I'll say, it's got to be sustainable. And one of the criticisms I think Canada has had in the Asia-Pacific or Indo-Pacific region is that we pop in and out, especially on the security side. So we're there for a little while, then we come out. And I heard this 15 years ago, and I was at the Department of National Defense. Don't just send a ship once in a while. You need to really get in there and get your hands dirty. So I hope that it comes with resources and we can sustain it.
I would just add to that based on the public reports that we've seen on what might be coming with the Indo-Pacific strategy, the focus is a lot on diplomacy, trade, a bit on defense. That's all important, but I will be looking at elements on intelligence and national security, which is very rarely in the public discussion in this country, but it has to be as part of, what are our interests in the Indo-Pacific. Part of it is the threats that we discussed. So what's in it for CSIS? What's in it for the RCMP, for CSC? What's their role? Are there additional resources for them? They're overstretched in many ways to address some of these threats. Can't say that I'm very optimistic that it will be addressed, but...
Thank you, Mr. Chong. Now, Mr. Frangostatos, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to our witnesses. My first question will go to Professor Junot and Mr. Rigby, and then I'll have something for Mr. Miller. Both of you have written, and it's come across again tonight, on the importance of the United States for Canada's national security. And as part of that, though, you've added a nuance, and I think that's a very important observation, and that is the polarization that we find in the United States. And beyond that, the rise of right-wing populism in the United States makes clear that the United States' role vis-a-vis Canadian national security is automatically under major question. So my question for you is, in light of that, what does that mean for Canada-China relations? And to take it one step further as well, and to return the focus to Canada, what might the rise of polarization in general in Canada, and specifically right-wing populism that we do see here in the country, what does that imply for Canada-China relations?
There's a lot there. I'll try to pick at least on some aspects. I think as much as everything we said about China at the beginning absolutely stands, when I think about the order of threats that Canada faces or potentially faces, number one is in some ways the United States. And when I say in some ways, I mean by some scenarios where the situation degenerates in the U.S., which are by no means guaranteed, that can pose a greater threat to Canada because of our massive dependence on the U.S. If the civil war scenario, I think, is very unlikely, but scenarios of contested elections, of more unpredictability in their foreign policy, more unilateralism, retreat from NATO and other organizations, intelligence sharing in the Five Eyes, and so on, that is potentially very concerning. The problem that we face is that we have no other option. People have been saying for 50 years we need a third way, we need to diversify our trade and other relations. Because of geography, we'll never be able to fully do that. So if you bring in the China dimension, what that means for me is that Canada has to make significant efforts to diversify its relations, including with democracies in East Asia, South Korea, India, Japan. We saw a new intelligence sharing agreement with Japan announced last week. That's great. That's what we need to do more of, to link these two issues. But it's hard. It's not easy because culturally we are so focused on the U.S.
And the rise of right-wing populism within Canada and polarization that we see here generally, how does that impact upon Canada-China relations?
Sure, maybe I can tackle that one. I do want to make a point, though, just about polarization in the United States. So there's the potential impact on the Canada-U.S. relationship, the old line about when the United States sneezes, Canada catches a cold. If there's extreme instability south of the border with respect to democratic backsliding, there will be an impact. But the other concern, I think, is that if the U.S. is roiling with instability, civil war type scenario, which I, again, would say is black swan and remote, it's going to impact U.S. foreign policy. And the U.S.'s ability to operate globally and to confront a China threat and confront any other threat will potentially be compromised because they'll be so inward-looking. So that would be one of the concerns I'd have. With respect to polarization in Canada, Thomas and I are actually working on a paper right now on domestic violent extremism. We see this as an emerging threat. A lot of it's coming out in the convoy discussions, et cetera. I think one of my concerns with respect to China is just in terms of resources, to be perfectly honest with you, because our intelligence agencies, our national security agencies, dealing with domestic violent extremism, the director of CSIS will tell you that's an emerging threat and something that we have to pay a lot more attention to, but we have limited resources. So again, it's a little bit like I was saying with respect to the U.S. If suddenly domestic violent extremism becomes the number one priority of our national security agencies, how are we going to operate globally? How are we going to confront the China threat? So there are lots of other dimensions to it as well. I don't have time to get into them, but that would be something that would jump out at me, the limited resources we have to deal with the spectrum of threats out there right now.
Chair, I only have a few, about 30 seconds left, so I will put to Mr. Miller, and maybe we can speak another time, sir, but you talked about long-term challenges. It brings to mind climate change. It brings to mind whether or not Canada can cooperate with China on that particular question. Perhaps colleagues across the way will raise that as well. It was a theme in our first panel, but I just leave that on the table. And again, glad to follow up afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Fracascatos. We'll now go to Madame Normandin for 5 minutes.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you to the three of you for your opening statements. I'd like to hear you talk about the information sharing between the various departments. Mr. Junot said that he appeared before the committee a year and a half ago, and he said that criminal prosecutions for cases of espionage is very complicated because RCMP has a role and CSIS has another role. The two groups don't necessarily talk. You talked about a national strategy on security. To what extent is that strategy inefficient if we don't resolve the whole issue of various departments that don't talk to each other properly? Thank you for your question, Mr. You're quite right to underscore this problem. We talk about this to a great extent in the U of O report published earlier this year. The question of information and sharing is very complicated. It's very easy for people outside to say, why don't you share more information? But practically speaking, it's difficult. There are laws that exist for a good reason in democracy. We have to respect privacy. We have to protect sources, etc. That being said, even when we look at all the restrictions that have to remain in a democracy, we can conclude that here in Canada, we're not doing a good job in terms of sharing information. There are cultural reasons for that, institutional reasons. In some cases, the reason is technological. So at the end of the day, in a context where we're talking about the Indo-Pacific strategy, if there is no a serious effort that accompanies this to resolve these structural problems, such as information sharing, such as human resources. We didn't talk about this today, but that's very important. If we don't deal with those fundamental things, we'll be very limited in our ability to deal with threats. In your report, you suggested that there should be a position that should be the hub for a national security. How can we improve this? Is there no to ensure that there's no dichotomy between various departments?
A whole section on governance in the report, and we made a couple of recommendations. The first was to create a cabinet committee on national security, which would be chaired by the Prime Minister. And again, we're a little out of step with respect to our Five Eyes allies and even the G7. We're the only country that doesn't have this type of a committee chaired by the Prime Minister. And we would like to think that if this committee were established, met on a regular basis, Prime Minister and key cabinet ministers in the national security, public safety space, getting regular intel briefs, dealing with issues every couple of weeks, that this would help solve some of the information sharing issues, because you'd have a natural sort of vector, a place where all of this intel was ultimately going to land on the Prime Minister's desk with key ministers. And so having that sort of target zone, I think, would help in some respects. And again, I think also just more strategically, it would really help, because we find that the government tends to be a little bit too ad hoc and responsive on national security issues these days. The incident response group is great, but it's responsive. It's not thinking longer term. The other recommendation we have is to actually create a stronger intelligence function at the center in PCO. So we have a group there called the International Assessment Secretariat right now, but we recommended that we take ITAC, the Integrated Terrorism Assessment Center. I got the acronym right? It's been a while since I've said it out loud. Take ITAC and consolidate it with IAS at PCO, and it would almost be like a mini kind of Director of National Intelligence like we have in the U.S. I don't want to push that comparison too far, but it would be a coordinating body that would, because if we don't have a big intelligence community, we shouldn't be having these problems, but a funnel to bring all that intelligence together, make sure that it's going to the right places, and ultimately being funneled up to this committee and to the Prime Minister, who is the key person who needs to have this to inform his or her decision making at the end of the day.
And international cooperation would be more credible if we had enabling us to have a better partnership with the fives. Canada benefits massively. We receive more than we receive, and one of the pillars of information charity is it's a two-way street. So if we go ahead with Vincent's suggestions in our part, if we give more, we'll receive more.
Now to Ms. Kwan for the final 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses. Mr. Miller, in his presentation, talked a little bit about sanctions and Magnitsky sanctions and imposing them. Canada, of course, has been very reluctant, very slow. In fact, in the situation with Hong Kong, the breaking of the one country, two system rule, a promise made to Hong Kongers, but not just to Hong Kongers, but to the international community as well. And the repercussions and what we're seeing now with the national security law reaching even here to Canada, with a Canadian journalist, Victor Ho, being targeted and being put on the wanted list. So my question to all the panelists is this: should Canada, in fact, embark on sanctions? And if so, what measures should we undertake, and what do you think the repercussions would be? Why is Canada so afraid to take action?
Well, I can take that question first. Absolutely, I think Canada should look very seriously at this. I think it should be taken from a targeted approach. So I think we should be looking specifically at targeted individuals that we can identify, that we feel like would be most impactful, but I don't think that we should be scared of this. I think that this is something that if we judge our foreign policy actions and our decisions based on how Beijing will react and how Beijing might coerce us, that's not a way to make those decisions. So I absolutely think that there's a precedent, a possibility, and other countries have taken these measures and have had serious discussions on this as well. So we're not alone on this, and I absolutely think that we should look at it.
I would endorse that view, and we impose sanctions on other countries in similar circumstances. So why would we have an exception for China? And given the circumstances of the last couple of years, there may have been reasons why we approach China a certain way, but I think to a considerable extent, those circumstances are no longer in place with respect to the two Michaels and others. So we can perhaps proceed in a more forceful fashion. But again, it's one tool. And we have a whole toolbox, lots of different kinds of things that we can do with respect to China, both internationally and domestically. So we have to keep that in mind. And while I'm a big fan of sanctions in certain circumstances, I think we need to look at what the ultimate outcome is going to be and what results we're going to get from those sanctions, and keep our expectations, I think, in the right ballpark.
I would answer yes, absolutely, but with a massive but. And this is something that we saw clearly in the debate on sanctions against Iran in the last couple of weeks. Our capacity to monitor and enforce sanctions in this country is massively overstretched. And Canada has a reputation among its allies, but also among the bad guys, as not being good at enforcing sanctions. We declare them and we don't follow up. And at some point, that's damaging because it signals to the bad guys that when we impose sanctions, we don't follow up, we don't enforce them. So yes, but there is a major need to significantly increase the resources for our sanctions capacity at Global Affairs, at CSIS, at the RCMP, at CBSA, and elsewhere. The $76 million that the government announced last week is a good first step, but it's really not enough. I'm not even sure, we don't have a lot of detail, but I'm not even sure that it's enough to do what they said they'd do on Iran, let alone on Russia and other countries on which we are not fully imposing the sanctions that we've declared. That means human resources, but it also means improving the process, including on information sharing, but on other aspects too. I think we really, there's a big gap between what we say and what we do.
Thank you. I think I have 1 minute. So just building on that, in terms of information sharing, but it's really a question on enforcement. And to a degree, really, CSIS is very limited in their ability to enforce. And so what enforcement tools, then, do we need to carry through? Because if you say it and you don't carry through, it's meaningless.
Just specifically on the sanctions side, or more broadly just in terms of the tools that we use?
Well, if I have time, more broadly, but I think we probably only have time for sanctions.
I'm not an expert on sanctions. On the enforcement side, I'm not exactly sure how we would approach that. I mean, I think Thomas's point is well taken. It's a matter of resources, and having worked at GAC a number of years ago, I know how small that unit for sanctions was. Very, very small. So it's more of a GAC lead than it is a CSIS lead, I think, when it comes to sanctions.
Thank you, Ms. Kwan. That is our time. And with that, I will thank our three visitors, Dr. Jeannot, Mr. Rigby, and Mr. Miller. Fascinating work. I have a feeling that we could probably keep you here a lot longer, but our technology will turn itself off in not that many minutes, so we'll have to call it a night at that point. Now, before we finish, though, Mr. Chong, you wanted to go through the process on your motion.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to move my motion, which I believe all members of the committee have in both official languages, that the committee study the matter of the 3 illegal police stations opened in the Greater Toronto Area by the Fuzhou Public Security Bureau of the People's Republic of China, that 2 meetings made up of 4 1.5-hour panels be allocated for the study of this matter, that the Minister of Public Safety and officials be invited to appear for 1 panel, that the RCMP and CSIS be invited for 1 panel, and that experts on police and intelligence be invited as witnesses for the other panels.
Thank you, Mr. Chong. Is there any discussion? Madame Normandy.
Oui, rapidement. Very briefly, I would like to move an amendment rather than having 4 periods of 1.5 hours. We could divide it into 6 periods of 1 hour.
Any discussion on the amendment? Shall we vote on the amendment? Madam Clerk, would you care to call the roll?
Absolutely. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So the vote is on the amendment from Ms. Normandin. Monsieur Cormier.
Contre.
Monsieur Dubourg.
Je suis contre.
Mr. Fragiscatos.
No.
Mr. Oliphant.
No.
Mr. Iacono.
Je suis contre.
Mr. Chong.
Contre.
Contre.
Mr. Kmeech.
Contre.
Mr. Seebeck. No. Madame Normandin.
Pour.
Ms. Kwan.
No.
So I declare the amendment defeated. Are we ready for the question on the main motion? Madam Clerk?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Main motion moved by Mr. Chong. Monsieur Cormier.
Pour.
Monsieur Dubourg.
Pour.
Mr. Fragiscatos.
Yes.
Mr. Oliphant.
Yes.
Mr. Iacono.
Pour.
Mr. Chong.
In favor.
Ms. Dancho.
In favor.
Mr. Kmeech.
Yes.
Mr. Seebeck. Madame Normandin.
Pour.
Ms. Kwan.
Yes.
All yeas, Mr. Chair.
So we'll declare the motion carried. We have not canvassed the issue of when we will do this, but perhaps that will be for another time. With that, I want to thank everybody for a very, very productive evening. Our clerk, our MP supporters, our analysts, our interpreters, our technical staff. It all came together very well. Fascinating session. Thank you all for being there. We declare this session closed.